So you just stick Tom in front of us. I said, yeah, pretty much. Yeah. Right. Everything. But today is a really special day for us as we are launching our third annual Charles K. Atkin Distinguished Speaker Series. But many of you know that this is not really the third time that we've done this event. In fact, this event has quite a history in this department. It started in the early 1990s after G.R. Miller passed away, where a fundraiser was created called Bowling for Scholars, and we raised money for what is now the G.R. Miller Fellowship, of which funds at least one person every single year, all right? But over time, this event has evolved a great deal. In fact, at some point after I was gone, but at some point after I graduated, we worked at making this an alumni speakers event. And we would bring back alum to talk to us about what research they've been doing since they had left. And in the early days, we would bowl afterward. Right? It continued to evolve into what people called the Spring Colloquium Series, and we still would bring in alum or distinguished friends of the department. In 2020, my brother from another mother, Brandon Vanderhyde, and I started talking about this event, and it was suggested, and I loved the suggestion, that we rename the event after Chuck Atkin. Now, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Chuck in just a second, but this event was also moved to October, okay? And it is now partnered. Now, you might think, well, October is often with homecoming events. Ours is always at the end of September, and this should be seen as a homecoming for our alum and our friends, the speakers that we bring in, all right? But it was also moved to October because Chuck Atkin was born on October 21st. And so this month is particularly chosen to honor Chuck. So Chuck was born, as I said, on October 24th in Washington, D.C. He lived there for a very short time because he and his dad, Ken Atkin, was the chair of the department here, and his mom, Dave, came back to Michigan. Now, for a short time, he lived in places. And Birmingham. For those of you that know Chuck well, our place to see a map is on it. This is a Chuck special right there. You love the map. But when he was in fourth grade, he moved back to East Lansing and looked for a graduate school, East Lansing, and specifically the zip code 48823 would be his home place. Okay? So, things that you should know about Chuck is that he did his undergraduate here. He went to Wisconsin where he received his undergrad or PhD, but he was always a true Spartan, led green, and he yelled very loudly at sporting events and never missed any of them. He was the chair of the department for 15 years, and in many ways still is, because you have no idea how many times I say, well, and usually that come up with some sort of answer. He was a fellow of ICA. He was a distinguished faculty in NCA. He won almost every major award that this university award, Yale University Distinguished Professor, Teacher, Scholar, all of them. He was the author of 10 books and over 150 chapters and articles. He testified to subcommittees of the Senate, House of Representatives, Presidential and White House Commissions, Surgeon General, and so on. He also testified and consulted with governments around the world. Um, he was an amazing father to Dan and Debbie, but with regard to our department, through a degree and an actual graduate, he was happily married to the love of his life after he was and they were unfortunately reckoned within this department. But for those of us here that lucky enough to know him, he was much more than a distinguished scholar with all these accolades. He was the captain of our ship in our softball team. So when someday I'm allowed to give Ron a roast, I'll tell you he was the captain. Because he's a forget this answer this time, okay? Because I think Ron thinks he was the captain, but he was not. Okay? So you can see he took up there with the softball picture. He never missed a softball game. He never missed touch football on Friday afternoons. He didn't miss our happy hours. He didn't miss a chance to bowl with us. He didn't miss a chance to walk down the hallway and sit with you. He was an amazing leader, right? And I'm really excited to be able to talk today because he's also somebody that I consider to be my friend. So there we are. And so that is the bar and beach. Yeah. So with that, I welcome you to the Charles K. Atkin Distinguished Speakers.
Yay! Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name, for those of you who don't know me, my name is and I'm a very and it's my great honor to introduce our first speaker. And we all know she's our fearless leader, a very lucky to all of our children's games, a funny wife and a fantastic host, a great friend, all of that stuff. But in addition to all of that, is a prolific persuasion scholar who was recognized as her focus is on the role that emotions play in underlying psychosocial processes, explaining. She's also the author of the Anger Activism Model, a behavioral theory explaining when anger is constructive versus destructive. So without further ado, let's welcome our first speaker, Monique. Dr. Monique.
All right. So let's go back to talking about Chuck. But before I do, I don't want to miss an opportunity to tell you about amazing students that have worked on this particular research program over the years. I hope I didn't miss anybody, but there's a number of people that have worked on they're amazing. So, as I was saying just a little bit ago, Chuck was a trailblazer in many ways, all right? And in one way that he was a trailblazer is he very early in his career, he conducted a whole series of systematic studies that provided great evidence as to the behavioral or, let's say, persuasive powers of advertising, okay? In particular, he provided evidence that shows that alcohol advertisements are for teenagers, all right, and encouraged drinking behavior among teenagers. He did a number of studies on issues of that sort. Later on, he transitioned into looking at the other half of this equation, which would be, can public health campaign messages encourage safe drinking behavior? Okay, so we know that these advertisements are getting people to drink. How do we, work against this color messaging, if you will? And I wanted to turn to one particular study, and I'll explain to you in just a bit here that this study was way ahead of its time, but it also sets the tone for my talk today, all right? So almost 30 years ago, in 1995, Chuck and Bill DeYoung published this content analysis that looked at televised PSA for alcohol impaired driving. Okay? And it's an interesting paper in many ways. It is not quantitative. It actually really digs into 137 different alcohol impaired driving PSAs, and they can provide a really thoughtful analysis of what's in the PSAs and what works and what wouldn't work and so on. Okay? And there are a number of themes here that are really relevant for people. Okay? So I'll point out these themes, and then when I move forward, it'll be really clear why I'm pointing out these things. Okay? So the first thing is that Atkin mentions that when you look at the advertisements from Mothers Against Drunk Driving, you notice that they frequently emphasize that alcohol impaired driving, okay, drunk driving, is the result of someone's decision to drive after drinking. In fact, the idea that we would call it an accident as a sort of a misnomer, this is no accident, right? And in fact, they argue that should be one of the themes in these cases. Drunk driving is not an accident. Okay. Now, it also points out, looking at others of these 137 PSAs, that in many acts, that the designated driver is presented as a hero who is self-sacrificing to save friends, if you will, and to earn that person's esteem and respect of their friends. So we want to see a hero in these messages, but heroes need an end. Okay. So in fact, with efforts to demonize alcohol impaired driving, it says in here, and I quote, we should focus not only on the drunk driver, that's enemy number one, right? But on the alcohol industry itself, which earns tremendous profit from sales to problem drinkers who are at risk for impaired driving. Those who drive after drinking are making bad choices, but they are induced to do so by a social, legal, and economic environment that promotes excessive consumption. Okay. Goes on to say that with regard to Mothers Against Drunk Driving, that their hope, that organization's hope, would engender a concern about the victims, but they wanted to motivate action. And in here, Atkin questions this. He says, if viewers remain angry, how would they channel that anger? These spots didn't say, right? So it goes on to say later that public anger about the toll exacted by alcoholic drivers must be channeled into demands for action from public officials. Such a campaign was undertaken in the 1960s by local state insurance. So he finally says in here that these campaigns must not only get people to not drink, but rather to stimulate and support public action. In fact, the most people, the majority, don't get impaired, but the percentage that do cause a lot of damage, right? And so we need to get people that are pro-attitudinal, right, that aren't doing this. We need them not to ignore the problem, right? He says we need to harness, their desire for this state of being into arguing for both action. All right, so here's some things you should know about this. In 1995, okay, and I read a lot on anger, but probably not every single thing that's ever been written, but a lot. Nobody talked about using anger in business. You barely can find it today. It's stunning. The term anger or feel doesn't appear in the literature until the early 2000s. Okay. It was not a thing. In fact, other content analyses done by Atkin and other colleagues show that the vast majority of public health campaigns in the 90s and before had no emotion in them at all. And those that did, it was fear. Okay? And so the idea that Atkin was arguing for stimulating anger was way ahead of its time. Okay? Now, I'm going to be honest with you. I read this article way after I started my program on anger. But I think it was out. I like this kind of in there. But it is the case that emotions have the power to influence. All right? It's a very general statement at this moment, right? They influence how we have the mode of processing. They can influence what we pay attention to. And they can motivate our actions. Okay? What we call action tendency. But as I started arguing along with others, it wasn't solo, in the early 2000s was that we can't think about emotions just by their influence. Negative emotions do this, and positive emotions do that, but rather by their unique, discrete category. That there's a lot of evidence that anger causes different responses than fear, for example, despite the fact that they're both goal incongruent or a negative experience of some sort. Okay? So I take the discrete paradigm, that's what I adopt, and we want to today talk about whether Atkin was on to something in the 90s. Does it work? And if so, how? And if so, what kinds of behaviors can be changed by angry people? Okay? In fact, Jared said this. The world needs anger. The world often continues to allow people because it's not angry enough. And although this is a really powerful quote, it should also be noted, and both societally and in the literature, that anger leads to very confusing outcomes. Okay? So, for example, we can see some angry people doing some pretty violent and destructive stuff, moving, breaking windows, right, things of that nature, engaging in aggressive, violent tendencies even. Okay? But we also see people who are very angry who decide to fight for change, that decide to put together organizations and relate to their people or I mean, they do very important activities in terms of working towards that. So is anger destructive or is anger constructive? And my answer is yes. Okay? All right. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. And let me define anger quickly. We could probably spend an entire day talking about what is an emotion, what is anger, and so on. So for the purpose of this project, anger is one emotional category that humans experience, okay? And it is marked by physiological arousal that is also accompanied by a certain pattern of cognitions. Okay? Emotional experiences tend to be both physiological and cognitive. Now, appraisal theory would suggest that there are a number of different ways that we appraise stimuli or an event that then ultimately and very quickly determine what emotion we've experienced. So for anger, when we see something as a demeaning offense or an injustice that was caused by a third party, in other words, you didn't cause it, that'd be guilt, right? You did it to yourself or to other people. So another party did this, and they did it on purpose. knew what they were doing. This wasn't an accident, right? So right away, you see that in the paper, he's really aligning with the appraisals of anger. Okay? All right, so far so good. So when we started doing this research, which was quite a long time ago, we looked at what are the precursors of anger. And you can see here, anger tends to be caused by a dual congruent event. Natural talks about that. We certainly need somebody to blame. We need an enemy, okay? And there needs to have been intent. So looking at attribution, we need to have done this knowingly, have been in control of our behaviors and so on. In terms of what anger causes, there are many hundreds of studies on the outcomes of anger, including a desire to remove the angering state. And so people call anger a revenge or an emotion. And I want to take away sort of the stigma of the word revenge, because revenge could be advocating for change, and revenge could be violence. Okay, but you're trying to fix the situation. Okay, anger tends to lead to a desire to make control. Research indicates that people who feel angry are more likely to also feel in control. Okay, that's very different than fear, for example. It tends to be motivated, energetic emotions. People may talk about the behavioral activation system as opposed to the inhibition system. And so this is a push emotion. And there have been studies that looked at anger's effects on cognitive processing. But there are studies that show that anger can lead to stereotyping, use of heuristics, and others that it can lead to animal behavior. So that led me to think, well, there's got to be money, right? I mean, if it leads to both, then we need to figure out what people are acting here. Okay, so that's what led to the anger activism model. Sorry, there we go. So the anger activism model was designed to explain what happens when people get an anger appeal. All right, it's a persuasion, though we've now applied other standards. So the first thing is that people are exposed to an anger appeal, and yes, I'll define that for you. It leads to anger, but anger varies in intensity. Nolan might get mad, right? Two could become furious. That's possible, and it is also possible for John to not care about that topic and not be angry at all, even though it is an anger appeal, right? And so we vary in our response. And this model argues that the mediating variable of how angry you feel matters a lot. Now, this was different because previous research really looked at this as a dichotomous variable. You're either angry or you're not angry, right? Compared to experimental groups, the older group and control group. And so we said, I want to know how angry you are, right? Okay. And we argue that the intensity of the anger is determinant of your cognitive processing. And now that we have the case now, we'll be looking at light eye tracking, EEG, heart rate, things like that. But the studies you'll hear today include measures. Now, that relationship is moderated first and foremost by efficacy. Do you see that this problem is fixable and that you can engage in those solutions, right? So can you fight if there's anything? Do you think that you could write to your rep and would that do anything, right? So, I'll argue is that when people have a strong sense of self-efficacy, that there's a linear relationship between anger and outcomes. And we argue for both processing and behavior, even though it isn't different. Okay? But at weak efficacy, we argue for an inverse you now relationship. So the people are very angry and they don't think that there's something that can be done, right? Can't be And then I'll tell you, we're all very the results are, maybe your results are all clean. Mine are always. Okay, so here you go. Intensity of the anger and efficacy. It doesn't self-efficacy up there, but it's probably the product of self-awareness. Yeah. Now, let's look at these last two pieces. In the 2007 piece that I wrote where I put forward the model, I also argued that anger will work for pro-attitudinal audiences. Okay? So, in other words, if you were a Republican candidate, your anger appeal is probably not going to make Democrats go, oh, now I want to vote for you. Okay? So, in fact, that's probably going to cause psychological reactions. It could make people want to vote for the other candidate more. And we are beginning studies in that, but I'm not presenting anything like that today. Okay? So, anger appeals really are for preaching to the choir, but you want to make the choir do something bigger, not to sit around and that's too bad that that's going on in society, right? But actually say, well, I'm going to do something. Okay. So it's for pro-attitudinal. And the last thing I'll mention is the model takes on a unique definition of behavior. First thing is, most of that can argue for, we want to see whether or not people are willing to engage in social activism. Okay? So this isn't about a personal health threat where you get a test or you start using condoms, right? This is about how you fight this angering justice. Okay? All right, so with that in mind, you can't add things up, they're not synonyms, and then take a mean. Because activism behaviors escalate in difficulty, and they escalate in the amount of commitment you have to do that. At the very low level, we do things like sign petitions, when you wear a t-shirt, like the Ducks team. But at a high level, it takes a lot more commitment and energy to form a group, to put together a protest, to attend a protest, and then be renewed, right? To canvass neighborhoods, right? That's not the same as y'all find your petition. And we have a paper on our review right now where we did create and plenty of them, and that's the measure I'll talk about today. It's not a okay, and it's the first scale. So every single movement is needed by this movement, and all of that is done in work presented today. Okay. Make sense so far? Cool. All right. So the first thing I'll talk about in brief really was one of our first attempts to really see the model had anything to do with it. Right? It's really juicy. And even though it was published in 2020, we did this a lot. It's one of those that you have to keep urging. Yes, I do understand. Thank you for that. I appreciate that. Right? And so what we did here is we had students at the University of Maryland, and they got some credit to do the study, of course, we had SONA, and it was a whole experiment. And what happened was people were randomly assigned to read out ads that were for change on campus. The topic was the Good Samaritan policy, which, if you're not familiar with, basically says if you're not 21, if a major problem happens with drinking, you need to be able to call an ambulance and get help without getting in trouble. So this, we have a strong anger appeal and a weak anger appeal, weak in all the language, okay? And basically it talks about Austin who got in a bunch of trouble for trying to save his friends, and this points to Maryland administrators as the enemy, and that they did this knowing that this policy had already been approved, and that this was unethical, it was right, this was not right, we have to do something to fix it, okay? Now, the message either has strong efficacy in it, like there's a lot we can do, as an example, or weak efficacy, and there's almost nothing we can do about this, okay? After they read this, they were presented with strong and weak or strong or weak arguments about fighting the administration of this policy, and because we wanted to see how people process messages. And in the simple form, if you're engaging in depth processing, which we argue that strong anger and strong efficacy should be too, then they should be persuaded by strong arguments, but not so much by weak. Right? And if they're strong, they feel strong anger. But weak efficacy, they might not notice the difference between those arguments and be persuaded by both. Okay? All right. So for the purpose of this study, that's what I want to really look at and show you. And that begins our journey in, do we have something here? Which is the first step of any model. Okay? We did manipulation check. Anger, feel positive anger, more than a weak anger condition, efficacy or efficacy. We pilot tested both arguments. But I can answer that later. I guess the same, but everything was piloted. Okay. What you can see here is that when in the high anger condition, even when they see efficacy, they were more persuaded, okay? And this is by positive okay. More positive about the strong message than the weak. But look at what happens when they're angry. They didn't feel there's much efficacy. They received weak efficacy cues. They were more persuaded by weak and strong. Weak is not going to be even, but they were significantly different. Just moving people. And so, and then of course over here, with low anger and high efficacy, they're equally persuaded. So that efficacy provides the ability, but not the motivation to really dig in. Okay? So we thought, okay, well, this is evidence that we're going in some good direction here. Okay? We also found that these, that the moderated mediation model, positive relevant thoughts is the key mediator to behaviors. Okay? So this is the sum of behavioral factors. And what you see here is that for people that were in the strong anger condition and strong efficacy, that they had the highest intention scores as mediated by positive relevant thoughts. Okay. So we kept going. So this is our way to say, okay, let's keep researching for a while because we've got something here. But we don't see a non-monotonic relationship that we like to see. Okay? So at strong efficacy, we can see that anger has an effect on cognitions and behaviors in the direction we could select. But at weak efficacy, we're not seeing any. We tested for the quadratic relationship. We did, just look at the means. It's not there. Okay. Now, second study I'll present, we also technological validity. The first study is very controlled, laboratory experiment with messages we created, we pilot tested, and so on. But I had a cool opportunity at Washington University. One of my doc students, Vanula Lakaban, worked for the Truth campaign. Okay? And in fact, this American Legacy Foundation was just like a block away from my office. People worked there to do their program. And so she and I were talking about the model and so on. She's like, that sounds a lot like Truth. How many of you know the Truth campaign? Okay, and I'll show you some of the messages. And so the Truth campaign, in fact, wanted people to see the tobacco industry as the enemy, right? And they didn't use the word anger appeal. They didn't know they were doing like a strategy that's been tough, but they were just their gut was on, right? They didn't gut think that this was. So the news said, tell you what, we can't get access to the data, but we can present our hypotheses to them. And we could see if the model data. So we wrote this paper with the people that ran Truth, like Donna Malone and Elizabeth Fair. These are pretty big names in the tobacco system and literature. And we submitted our hypotheses to the Right. So this isn't an experiment, right? We just randomly assigned and we have no control group, so keep that in mind. These are real campaign recipients, if you will. Okay, so now when we did this, that we were on to version 2.0 of Truth. And that campaign was called Finish It. And it fit the graphicism really well because what they wanted was to get 9%, or rather, the 91% of people who don't smoke to fight with tobacco, right? So instead of focusing on smokers, they said, let's focus on non-smokers. Let's create our own social network army. Let's get them to take to social media. Let's make things as uncomfortable as possible as we can. So we're going to recruit an army of non-smokers. That was the idea behind the point. Okay? And so this tagline came along with the campaign, Be the Generation That Ends. Okay, so we focused on two ads in particular. The unpaid tobacco spokesperson, we've done this. Okay, so quit giving tobacco or the tobacco industry this. Okay, so we wanted to focus on people that had seen those two ads, one of those two ads. And we used the Truth Initiative Media Monitoring Tracking Survey, which is a rolling cross-sectional survey. As you can see, focused on adolescents age 15 to 21. They gathered 140 participants per 4 weeks, so they could have thousands of participants. And we analyzed the data from July 14 through July 15, almost 5,000 people. Okay. Now, we have to make sure they're pro-attitudinal, so we did a check of that, right? So you can see we have questions about, I would want to be part of the movement and smoking, taking a stand is important to me, and so on. And so we took measures to make sure we were working with the pro-attitudinal audience. We also needed to make sure they had seen the ads, because just because this campaign was the most funded campaign in the history of public health, right? It doesn't mean everybody saw every ad. So the media monitoring survey had text-aided awareness and visually aided awareness. And so we studied people that said, I've seen that by self-report. So far, so good? Okay. Now, when you engage in a study where you're using somebody else's data, you sometimes have to look at their questions and be flexible, right? So secondary data can be tough in that way. They did have a question that said, saying this ad made me feel angry. Okay, all right. And they also had this question. They didn't directly measure efficacy, that I can do this. I can, post this on social media or whatever. But they had this question, saying this ad made me feel powerful. We used it as a proxy for empowerment, if you will. All right. Here are our dependent variables. We measure persuasiveness, receptivity, And they asked about whether or not the ad sparked conversation. Something a few people in this room and the others are interested in whether campaigns lead to interpersonal conversation. Okay? All right, so these were our so you can see that's more females than males. Age was around 18 and so on. So we have now, one thing I do want to point out is that this wasn't an experiment. So all we did this is we took the anger question and the empowerment question, and we engaged in a K-means cluster analysis to break them out into anger groups and efficacy groups for each of them. Okay? Because we needed to know that they were actually more angry than the others. I did not want to use any kind of median split because that just leaves all the moderates in both groups. Okay? And so what that means is when you do it this way, you're not equal cell sizes. Okay? So here you can see, in terms of high efficacy, only 5% of our sample were in that group. Now we have found that with other studies like this. So then the question becomes, what can a few people do, right? So I just wanted you to be aware of that. And we also showed that even the really most angry people weren't like tipping the scale. They were on a scale of 1 to 5, they were above a 3.5, but they weren't in 4.5. Okay. Okay. So here. Now this is just based on a weighted ANOVA. So we weighted the data, especially given unequal cell sizes. And so here what you can see right away is that for the weak efficacy group, you still see that linear trend in the means you don't see of it. Okay, so once again, we're seeing that their numbers are yeah, okay. Their means are lower, but they're not, it's not an inverse. Okay. All right. But for analysis that we engage in is actually quite different than usually we actually did a logistic regression. And we wanted to see whether the odds of engaging in a conversation, being receptive, being persuaded, increase with being in the high anger, high efficacy group relative to low baby. Okay? And okay. So for the high anger, high efficacy group, you can see that they were, and this is for the centers of the data, 49 times more likely to be. You just said that back. We were like fairly this long. You can see they did it again and said this is interesting. So 28 times more likely to be receptive and 25 times more likely to convert. The odds ratios are smaller for unpaid, but similar. Okay. So, being in that group that experienced the most amount of anger and felt powerful made them more likely to do everything. Now remember, that's only 5% of people. Okay? But this was the campaign that received more national exposure than any other campaign in our history. So it's 5% of thousands. And you can look this up online. There's a lot written about dosage and exposure to this campaign. Right? So that's still a lot of people. And if they're talking to people about it, they become a conduit for change. And so that's, I'm trying to be really realistic about the finding, but also this kind of interest. All right? Okay. So I want to move on to final study. Okay. This is one that's not helpful. Our team did this recently, and we're still finishing up the link. And I'll just show you a couple findings. So in this study, we had 28 or 2,300 M-jerkers, okay? And they were randomly assigned to an anger appeal, and a neutral appeal, or okay? And we measured a number of outcomes, but I'm going to focus on behavior for this. Okay? So I'll just show you part of the message that we created, and the whole team created the script, and then you'll recognize the voice. And Jackie created the actual video. No, it's not. Shoot, here. I have to do.
Push. That's over 1 million pounds per minute. These scores are written why are businesses pushing plastic bags on consumers? Because even though they know the negative impact, plastic bags are cheaper and eco-friendly alternatives. To their financial benefits and this is injustice. We can't sit still. 3 million plastic bags in the Atlantic Ocean. Innocent sea turtles, whales, and animals consuming the plastic, directly resulting in one.
So you can see that point. And this I did earlier how we define anger, but anger appeals are persuasive appeal that leverage the appraisals that are consistent with the emotion. So other blame, injustice, intentionality, and so on. Okay. And then we pilot test to see does it actually induce anger. Okay. All right. So earlier today, we did find that people in the anger condition were angrier than in the other conditions. Out of 0 to 100, the strong anger group was, the anger group had a mean of 66. And you can see in the irrelevant group, it was about 30 for anger. I don't know what they were angry about. Okay. What I want to focus on for today is just the behavior issue, but you can see some other results here. Earlier, when I mentioned the model, talked about the model, I said, look, behavior kind of has a special thing here. Because at the low commitment level, we really shouldn't see any significant differences among groups. If you're proactitudinal, why not sign up, right? Okay. So if we take the behaviors apart and look at them separately, that's where we can start seeing some differences. In other words, the people that we say, would you be willing to form your own group? Would you be willing to organize a protest? The original 2007 piece said that's where we should see differences, right? Most people have a petition if it's something they agree with. Not everybody's going to go to a protest or testify or anything like that. So I thought it'd be fun to show you some of the behaviors. Now remember I told you the first one scale so you can see the weights. So here's a low commitment in our work. I want to advocate. Now you're not actually advocating for plastic, just to be clear, but again, okay. And so what you can see here is at the low commitment level that we see basically two linear relations. As this amps up, join us all for 10 people, the week after the starts to bend. And at the highest commitment one, we also see what we predicted in the beginning. So that was it to us to see, okay, it's the high commitment behavior where you're likely to see those differences. Not necessarily at the low levels. So we've been working on this and thank you to TV and it's wonderful. All right, so we have been working on understanding whether or not anger can be a productive way to get change. And there's evidence that it can be, but predominantly for people that feel that change is possible and that they can do something. What we're going to do now is study these in the laboratory, look at eye tracking and see whether or not anger actually directs attention. As Debbie said earlier, right? So we'll be looking at that. We'll be looking at heart rate and other measures of cognitive load, pupil dilation, for example. So beware, I'll probably be reaching out to some of you because you might know I'm actually doing it. I do work. And so I want to work with other people and get deeper into the cognitive mechanisms of anger. The other thing that our team has recognized is we've never been able to really get a low efficacy group. Whenever we measure efficacy and then we do our cluster analysis and so on, it's still always sort of moderate. Like we haven't found that there's nothing that can be done. We're screwed. We haven't found that. So we're now pilot testing a load of topics. Where can we get a large amount of variance in efficacy? What topics are those where some people feel like there's nothing that can be done? So a couple summers ago, Ruth and I embarked on anger appeals with Black Lives Matter messages. We studied Black citizens, but even there, some of them felt that this could be fixed. And I'm like, what? I do want people to say this is cool. We still are searching for that topic where we have enough people in a real group. So if you have ideas for us, let us know. But I will end with that.
Question. In the groups that you look at, do you see very good distinctions between male versus female in terms of how anger they would get and like?
Thank you for asking that. So we actually did a study where we looked at anger as an audience of people and then looked at the demographics of the different groups. And so, no, they're equally likely to be men or women. There's really nothing there except for trait anger. People with high trait anger are more likely to, by definition. Yeah, that paper, I think, if you're interested, I can show you Mugen. So, no, there's not really a demographic specifically. Anger is one of those universal emotions that's experienced by all people, but not necessarily people that vary how long the anger episode lasts, right? So that. John,
I do. When it comes to anger, I'm interested in your thoughts on what I'll call new anger versus old anger or prolonged anger. If something happened last week and I'm really angry about it, and I get a message that is message of efficacy. What's the difference between that and if it's something I've been angry about for 2 years and I'm getting the same message?
Okay, so we don't have data on that. So I can't answer that empirically. However, I'll give you my thoughts on that if that's all right. So anger dissipates fairly quickly for the vast majority of people. It would be unhealthy for us to just stay angry, right? So it does diminish. And so if you're angry for something from 2 weeks ago, and then you get a high efficacy message, it would totally be dependent on how you feel at that moment. It might have been, but are you still a 60 today, right? The other thing is anger can be restarted really quick. okay? But the more you experience it, what we see societally is that it gets faster and faster and faster. And that's what we've seen with gun control, right? So something happens and people become angry again, people move fast now. It didn't happen. We stayed angry for a while. So these are my opinions, just so you know, of observing this, but I've not been able to study the logic yet. Vernon.
I have another informed opinion question for you. A possible meeting, but working the the impact of secondhand smoke data as generating a threat and combine that with anger.
So change the topic to secondhand smoke.
Well, to the extent that we're aware of secondhand smoke being a danger to everybody, and if someone 20 feet away is smoking versus, no, that.
Yeah. So protection and motivation theory was created for personal health threats, right? And in its early initiations, and then of course in the parallel processing model and the processing model. But so they were really talking about where this is about something that could harm you or somebody who love very much. But here, the threats are a societal threat, and it's not about like a looming danger, using Lazarus's words, but more like an injustice.
Right?
Yeah.
How the models.
Oh, yeah. So they actually, the model was very similar to the EPPM.
Right.
But here are some differences. Okay. So he doesn't talk at length about the intensity of the felt anger, but more about the intensity of the cues in the appeal. And I know that seems minor, but to me it's not. Okay. So her model is more about the message design than the psychological experience, even though people don't often read it that way. That's how it's written. That makes sense? So it's an in the weeds kind of difference. No, it's okay. You can hammer away. Okay. It looks very similar, Ron, to be honest. Yeah.
So back to the question in terms of second smoke.
Yeah. So is the question really about what people would do, like how that would affect them? Do they feel threatened?
Right. General knowledge of people that smoke is a threat.
Yeah.
And so I'm already anger, but and also
Yeah.
or a larger ambient.
Yeah. Yeah. So you asked for an opinion, right?
Yeah.
I think that as knowledge of the dangers of smoking and secondhand smoking, even tertiary, which we now know, right? So, like on your clothes, that when somebody is violating your rights, like right in front of you, and it seems as though there can be a decision to smoke right in front of people, I do think it makes sense. Now, the question becomes, do they feel personally their skill set, their interpersonal skill set, to approach that person and change them, right? So if they have that high efficacy, those are the people that, in my opinion, will go up and say, I need you to put this cigarette out. That's not okay. And a lot of other people are like, I cannot handle this conflict well. I'm just going to walk away. It's probably good for you, frankly. And so I think that it comes down to, do they feel that they could cope with the situation? And that's that efficacy piece. I'll look at that. And any other questions, Rob? Yeah.
It seems to me that one of the differences one is like typical when you put your anger as opposed to fear. You oftentimes think of someone striking out with anger off from fear. And really looking for your thoughts about how that might distinguish the two models.
Yeah, thank you. So first thing is you did touch on something that distinguishes the models I didn't mention before, which is our measurement of behavior. Okay. So, but one thing that we haven't done yet, but still answers your question, is actually look at disruptive behaviors. Okay. So, yeah, there's one of those. Chris Gurka actually did a paper recently where he looked at whether or not people have a high level of retribution. In other words, do they think that engaging in what I earlier called disruptive behavior is the only way to fix this? Okay. And so then it may be the case that in some situations people are more likely to say, we're going to have to bust the window, we're going to have to park outside somebody's door, that we just haven't measured.
So it's really brought thousands of years ago, right? Where striking out doesn't fix the problem.
But it feels good.
It's a coping mechanism.
Yeah.
It's not a coping mechanism. So now instead of sticking my head in the sand, which is what the fear field stuff talks about, here I'm experiencing a coping mechanism through catharsis by striking out
Yeah.
and harming, the target. So
Yeah. Yeah.
that's what I find as an interesting distinction between the two.
Yes, I agree. And I want to, that needs to be high on our list of one of the next studies we do, is looking at other behaviors that aren't just constructive social activism, but other kinds of striking out behavior.
Just thinking, I'm talking to Ron, who they will process and I think that's kind of the umbrella category that some of what you're talking about.
Yeah. Yes, and we do have data on accuracy motivations, defense motivations, information avoidance, and seeking. Some of that is in the paper that Eugene put on the Atkin if people are interested in it. I just didn't present them today, but we do have some of those maladaptive responses like information avoidance. Interestingly enough, people high in anger and high efficacy both said they seek more and avoid more. So we have to dig into that because clearly they're seeking some stuff and avoiding other stuff. So I think that's why we need to get into the lab and see what are you seeking out, what are you avoiding, like literally looking at what they look at. So they're both maladaptive and addictive. Both of you. Okay. One last question, then we'll go to lunch, because we have lunch for you all. Yeah, so the first thing with regard to attribute, okay, so we have to think somebody did this on purpose. Okay, that's what leads to anger. Fear, for example, has a whole sense of uncertainty about how this happened around it, but anger is like, you did this, you knew better, and so on. Now, you asked about motivation, right? Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so there are people that are impacted by anger with yourself, and this is where our lead language and our academic crash and explode. Because what may be happening is that you're really feeling shame, that I did the same, I should have known better, now I hurt people. And we might say, I'm angry with myself, but the physiological reaction is probably the most similar to shame. And so that's the problem is that academics would say, I know you're saying you're angry, there's no, it's actually shame. So, but to be honest, I'd love to study that. I'm not exactly sure how to untangle it all because that's going to be messy, but messy is fun. Yeah, that's a good example. You know what? I don't really know, to be honest. It makes sense. You can be, people say you're angry with themselves, but, you know, study after study after study after study, when people say, describe a scenario when you were the most angry, they don't describe that they're angry with themselves. There's thousands of studies like that. And so it's really hard to figure out whether they really, sometimes our language doesn't align with, I'm babbling. Let's talk more. Bill.
The thing I'm interested in this is what people actually do as a result of being angry. Is there a way in the study to add a component where they can actually get something, either by writing a letter, write online, and seeing the difference in what is expressed and actually behavior?
Yeah, there is. We did a study with antibiotic resistance. There was an angry message or a neutral message. And then at the end, they could click on a real petition that was misprescribing antibiotics. Okay. So and the problem was that it kind of fell apart in our study, just logistically, because people just didn't click the button at all. Like, most people just not study it. And so we need to re-engage that kind of thing. So we can measure their anger, measure their intentions, and then if there are real things people can do, like donate to a cause, if they can sign a real petition, the behavior is the problem. It's hard to track the difference without a grant. And then it has to be, we just have to be careful about sending angry people, out there and then being like, whoops, okay, they did. I agree with you with the correct behavior. You're trying to figure out how to do that. What ideas?
But maybe with a GoFundMe.
Yeah. All right, gang. So, first of all, thank you so much. Atkin is right. That's the theme. The talk at 1 to 1 6.